Scorching Sunday. In the park, a mother holds her daughter's hand and whispers, "Honey, I can't buy water." The girl pretends she isn't thirsty. On a nearby bench, a millionaire pauses his run and watches. Between them, a bottle that costs little, yet weighs a lot. Pride, shame, power. He can stay on the shaded path. They must cross the burning lawn. Then a small, invisible detail stops the world for a moment. Who helps without humiliating? Who accepts without feeling smaller? When need meets conscience, one choice changes the course of that park and those who pass through it. The heat arrived before the sun on that Sunday morning in Los Angeles. By the time light touched the eastern hills, the air along the LA River already felt thin and used, the kind of dryness that made throats close and lips crack before anyone noticed. Claire walked the gravel path with Luna skipping ahead, the girl's sneakers kicking up dust that hung suspended in the windless morning. They had come early because the park was free and because Luna needed to move, needed to chase the pigeons that scattered across the lawn in gray waves, needed to burn the restless energy that filled their small apartment like trapped heat. Claire carried a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, made from the last of the bread before Monday's grocery run. She had done the math 3 times that morning, counting bills on the kitchen counter while Luna slept. Bus fare for the week, the agency fee for her work placement, the quarters for the laundromat. Every dollar had a destination already, every coin spoken for before it left her wallet. The park filled slowly around them. Runners in bright shirts passed in rhythmic intervals. An elderly man stretched against a bench, his joints cracking audibly in the quiet. At the pull-up bar, 3 young men took turns, their breath visible despite the heat. White puffs of effort in the still air. Luna ran back to her mother, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with the kind of joy that comes from simple movement. "Mama, I'm thirsty." Claire looked toward the kiosk in the center of the park. A line had formed already, people waiting with bills in hand. She knew the prices without looking at the board. $3.50 for water. $4 for anything cold. She had seen the numbers creep up week by week, watched Mr. Ortiz change the signs whenever the weather forecast promised more heat, more drought, more desperation. "Let's sit down first, honey," Claire said, guiding Luna toward a bench in the shade of a pepper tree. But Luna pulled against her hand, drawn toward the kiosk like a plant toward light. "Please, I'm really thirsty." Claire stopped walking. Around them, people continued their morning routines, oblivious or accustomed to these small private calculations. She knelt down, bringing her face level with her daughter's, and searched for words that would be honest without being cruel, true without being humiliating. "Honey, I can't buy the water right now." Luna's face changed, not with anger or tantrum, but with understanding that came too early, the kind of knowledge children should not need. She looked at the kiosk, then at her mother, and nodded. The nod hurt more than crying would have. At the counter, Mr. Ortiz stacked bottles with mechanical efficiency. His smile was professional and distant, the expression of someone who had heard every plea and learned to ignore them all. The price was posted. The price was the price. Some people in line glanced toward Claire and Luna, then away. Others pretended not to notice. The flow of commerce continued. Part 2. Michael Carter stopped running. He stood 30 yards from the kiosk, hands on his hips, breathing hard from maintaining his pace through the dry morning. Sweat traced lines down his temples, darkened the collar of his gray running shirt. He had chosen this route deliberately, had started coming to this park 6 months ago because his assistant had suggested he needed to see the city without glass between himself and its reality. The suggestion had annoyed him at first. Now, standing in his own sweat with his heart still racing, he understood what she had meant. He had heard the woman's words clearly. The park was not crowded enough yet to mask such plain truth. "I can't buy the water." 4 words that cut through the carefully constructed distance between his morning runs and the life of the city they crossed. Michael got in line. He did not decide to get in line. His legs simply moved, carrying him forward while his mind was still processing what he had witnessed. The line shuffled forward. A teenager bought 3 bottles and walked away without looking at his change. A woman in yoga clothes ordered a green smoothie that cost $7. Michael reached the counter. "Water," he said to Ortiz. "$3.50. Michael handed over a $5 bill. "Another one. I'll take it to that girl over there." Ortiz rang up the second bottle without expression. $7 total. Michael took both bottles, waited for his change, and walked toward the bench where Claire and Luna sat. He did not rehearse what to say. He did not think about the gesture as charity or kindness or anything that required naming. He simply walked over and handed the bottle to Luna. "Here." Claire looked up, recognition and resistance warring in her face. She opened her mouth to refuse, pride already forming words. But Luna had already taken the bottle, already unscrewed the cap with small, determined hands. The girl drank, and the sight of her daughter drinking made Claire's refusal die unspoken. "Thank you," Claire said, the words costing her something Michael could see but not name. He nodded once and turned away, picked up his run again, legs finding their rhythm. But the scene stayed with him, replaying as his feet struck pavement. He had seen the prices at this kiosk climb for months. He knew there was a contract, an exclusive arrangement granted by the city's Department of Recreation and Parks. He knew where these contracts came from, how they were renewed, what they required to exist. Power and access, and the ability to turn public space into private profit. He pulled out his phone as he ran, snapped a photo of the price board without breaking stride, made a mental note of the concession number posted on the kiosk side panel. Then he ran faster, letting the burn in his lungs match the anger building in his chest. Part 3. That afternoon, Michael's mansion in Hancock Park seemed to exist in a different city entirely. Cool air whispered through hallways. Light filtered through gauze curtains. In the living room, someone had arranged white roses in a crystal vase, their scent subtle and expensive. The house manager moved through rooms with practiced efficiency, checking details, adjusting pillows, ensuring everything aligned with the standards Michael required without needing to state. Michael crossed the entrance hall toward his office, mind still occupied with the morning scene, with the calculations he was already beginning to make. He barely registered the gray uniforms of the domestic staff until one of them looked up from arranging flowers in the front parlor. Their eyes met. Recognition came simultaneously to both of them. The woman from the park was Claire. The woman who could not buy water for her daughter worked in his house 3 days a week, cleaning rooms he barely entered, washing sheets he slept on, maintaining the invisible infrastructure that allowed his life to function smoothly. Claire's face went carefully blank. She returned her attention to the flowers, hands steady despite what must have been racing thoughts. Michael stopped walking. The connection was not coincidence. It was pattern, system, structure. The same forces that made water unaffordable at a public park were connected to the choices he made as an employer, the agencies he contracted, the wages that made a mother unable to buy a $3 bottle on a hot morning. "Claire." Janet's voice cut across the hall, sharp with authority. Janet was the house manager, had been for 8 years, knew every corner of the mansion and every rule that governed it. She approached with the stride of someone whose power came from proximity to power, whose influence depended on controlling access and information. "Ma'am," Claire said quietly, "the guest room linens need to be changed before 4. "Yes, ma'am." Janet's gaze flicked to Michael, assessing whether he had noticed the exchange, calculating whether this moment of recognition posed any threat to the careful hierarchy she maintained. She smiled, professional and cool. "Mr. Carter, the board meeting materials are in your office." Michael nodded, but he did not move toward the office immediately. He stood in the hallway, watching Janet guide Claire toward the stairs with a hand that did not quite touch her shoulder, but still managed to direct, control, command. He understood suddenly that Janet's power was not just administrative. It was about keeping people separate, keeping stories from connecting, maintaining the walls that let some people run in parks, while others cleaned their houses. He would need to know more, but he already knew enough to begin. Later that evening, after the board meeting ended and the mansion fell quiet, Michael sat in his office with his laptop open and files spread across the mahogany desk. He had sent one email to his compliance department, requesting a review of all household contracts and supply purchases for the past year. He had sent another to his legal aid, asking for public records on the park kiosk concessions, including contract amendments, fee structures, and public records, and price regulations. Now he waited for the information, fingers drumming on the desk, mind working through connections that were starting to become visible. The park situation was not isolated. The mansion's operations were not separate. Somewhere in the overlap of these systems, there were people benefiting from opacity, from distance, from the assumption that no one would look closely enough to see the pattern. His phone buzzed. A text from the legal aid. "Found the park contract. It's been renewed 4 times without rebidding. Exclusive beverage rights. No price caps, even during drought emergencies." Michael typed back, "Send me everything. Timeline, amendment dates, parties involved." The compliance department email arrived next. The subject line was neutral. Initial findings, household procurement. But the attachment was not neutral. There were duplications, inconsistencies, purchases authorized by Janet that showed no competitive quotes, vendors that appeared repeatedly despite higher prices than market rate. One vendor name appeared in both lists, the park report and the mansion audit. The same company that supplied Ortiz's kiosk chain also supplied cleaning products to the house. Michael leaned back in his chair. The overlap could be coincidence, but coincidence in procurement patterns was usually something else. It was a network, a system of favors and kickbacks, and arrangements that existed just below the surface of legitimate operations. He spent the next 3 hours building a timeline, cross-referencing purchase orders with dates, amounts with market prices, vendors with ownership records. His assistant had told him once that real change required obsessive attention to detail, that you could not fight systems with outrage alone. You needed evidence. You needed method. You needed to be patient enough to see the whole picture before you acted. By midnight, he had the outline. Ortiz maintained inflated prices at the park through his exclusive contract, which had been renewed without competitive bidding during drought periods when demand was highest and scrutiny should have been strongest. At the mansion, Janet authorized purchases from preferred vendors at prices that exceeded market rate, suggesting either incompetence or something more deliberate. The vendors overlapped. The timing of payments suggested coordination. It was not proof yet, but it was enough to know where to look. Part 5. Michael spent the following week gathering evidence, with the methodical patience of someone building a legal case. He visited the park 3 more times at different hours, photographing the price boards, documenting the absence of drinking fountains, despite regulations requiring them in public recreation areas. He bought bottles at various times, kept the receipts, compared prices with other parks in other neighborhoods. The pattern was clear. This park charged more, provided less, operated under rules that seemed designed to maximize profit at the expense of access. His compliance team worked quietly on the mansion side, pulling invoices, checking inventory logs against purchase orders, interviewing staff about procurement procedures. They discovered that Janet had created an emergency supply reserve at an off-site storage unit, justified as necessary for last-minute needs. But the frequency of these emergencies and the amounts ordered suggested something else. She was siphoning supplies, authorizing overpurchases, creating slack in the system that she could convert to personal gain. One of the domestic workers, a man named Carlos, who had worked at the mansion for 12 years, told the compliance interviewer about the pressure Janet applied. She tells us that if we want the good shifts, the holiday bonuses, we need to remember who makes those decisions. She says Mr. Carter trusts her completely, so complaining is pointless. She reminds us that we work through agencies, that she could have us reassigned anytime. The interviewer asked if there were specific incidents Carlos could document. Last month, she told Claire, one of the housekeepers, that she needed to work an extra Sunday without pay or she would lose her weekday slots. Claire has a daughter. She needs consistent hours. She agreed. Michael read the interview transcript twice. The abuse was not just financial. It was about power, about using precarity as leverage, about creating fear that prevented people from speaking. Meanwhile, his legal aid mapped the ownership structure behind the kiosk chain. Ortiz was not the owner, merely the operator. The actual business belonged to a holding company that had won the initial contract 6 years ago through a competitive bid that, according to the public records, had featured only 2 bidders. The competing bid had been submitted by a company that dissolved 3 months after losing, suggesting it might have been a phantom created solely to make the process appear competitive. The renewal process was even cleaner. No rebids required. The contract simply renewed annually with an automatic price adjustment clause tied to operational costs. But there was no transparency about those costs, no public review, no mechanism for challenging the increases. The drought emergency declarations should have triggered additional scrutiny, should have required price freezes or public subsidies. Instead, they had been used to justify higher prices. Michael compiled everything into a single document, cross-referenced and sourced. 50 pages of evidence showing a pattern of exploitation that existed because people assumed no one would connect the pieces, because the victims had no voice, because the system protected itself through complexity and intimidation. It was time to act. Part 6. Claire had started to feel the weight of Janet's attention. It began subtly. Schedule changes announced at the last minute. Assignments to the least desirable tasks. Small comments that carried implications without stating threats. Janet never said directly that Claire's presence at the park that morning had been noticed, that her brief conversation with Mr. Carter had registered as a violation of invisible rules. But Claire felt it. She felt it in the way Janet lingered when giving instructions, in the pauses that suggested something unspoken, in the questions about Luna that seemed to probe whether Claire would bring her daughter around again. The pressure was atmospheric, environmental, the kind of control that worked by making people feel constantly observed and judged. Then the direct conversation came. Janet called Claire into the pantry on a Thursday afternoon, closed the door behind them. The small room felt immediately smaller. the air dense with the smell of stored supplies and the tension of uneven power. "I've been hearing things," Janet said. Her voice was calm, almost friendly. "Talk about you and Mr. Carter, that you've been seeking his attention." Claire's stomach dropped. "I haven't. I'm not accusing you of anything." Janet smiled. "I'm protecting you. People gossip. They make assumptions about domestic workers who try to go above their station. I'm sure that scene at the park was innocent, but perception matters. If Mr. Carter thinks you're trying to use your daughter to manipulate him emotionally, to create some obligation. I know that. But does he? Does everyone else in the house?" Janet moved closer, her voice dropping to something that could have been mistaken for concern. "I'm on your side, Claire. I'm trying to help you keep your job. But you need to be smart. No more conversations with Mr. Carter, unless I'm present. No more bringing your personal life into this house. Can you do that?" It was not a question. It was a command wrapped in the language of advice, a threat disguised as protection. Claire nodded, not trusting her voice. She left the pantry with her hands shaking, returned to her work folding laundry in the upstairs hall. But her mind was elsewhere. She understood now that the water at the park was not an isolated moment. It was connected to everything, to Janet's control, to the way power operated invisibly, to the assumption that people like Claire could be kept silent through fear. That evening, after her shift ended, Claire sat on the bus heading home and made a decision. She pulled out her phone and composed an email to the staffing agency's HR department. The words came slowly, carefully chosen to be factual without sounding emotional, detailed without seeming like a complaint. She described the pressure she had received from Janet. She quoted specific statements. She included dates and times. She mentioned the threat about losing her position if she maintained any direct contact with Mr. Carter. She authorized the agency to review her phone records, her work history, anything that might verify her account. Before she could reconsider, she pressed send. The bus rolled through the evening traffic, carrying Claire toward her apartment, where Luna waited with the neighbor who watched her. Claire felt terrified and relieved simultaneously. She had used the only weapon she had: transparency, documentation, the truth, put on record where it could not be denied or rewritten. Part 7. Michael received the compliance report on Monday morning. He read it in his office with coffee growing cold in his cup, anger building with each page. Janet had constructed a small empire within his household, using her authority to extract personal benefits and to control staff through intimidation. The financial theft was significant, thousands of dollars over several years. But the human cost was larger, harder to quantify. People had worked in fear. They had accepted abuse because they needed the income. They had been told, explicitly and implicitly, that complaining was futile. At the same time, his legal aid had finished mapping the public case against the park concession. The evidence was clear. The contract had been structured to avoid oversight. The prices had been inflated beyond any reasonable operational cost. And the drought periods that should have triggered public protection mechanisms had instead been used to justify further exploitation. Michael made two decisions simultaneously. For the park, he would file a formal complaint through the city's 311 system and directly with the Department of Recreation and Parks. But he would not simply complain. He would offer a solution. His foundation would fund the installation and maintenance of drinking fountains at strategic locations throughout the park, with usage meters and monthly public reporting. The cost would be covered for 5 years, giving the city time to budget for permanent infrastructure. In return, the city would review the exclusive beverage contract, institute price caps during drought emergencies, and open a registry for licensed vendors who could compete fairly. It was not charity. It was investment in infrastructure that should have existed already, coupled with pressure for systemic change. For the mansion, he would initiate an internal investigation into Janet's conduct, suspend her individual authorization privileges immediately, and implement new procurement procedures requiring competitive quotes for all purchases over $200. He would also create a direct reporting channel for domestic staff that bypassed management entirely, allowing anyone to report concerns confidentially to the company's HR department. He drafted both plans carefully, reviewed them with his attorney, refined the language to be clear and non-negotiable. Then he began making calls. The city official who handled his complaint was initially skeptical, accustomed to complaints without solutions, criticism without commitment. But when Michael outlined his foundation's offer, complete with engineering plans, budget projections, and maintenance schedules, the tone shifted. This was not a protest. This was a proposal with resources behind it. The fountains would be operational within 60 days, Michael said. Your department would retain oversight but have no maintenance costs for 5 years. All I'm asking in return is that you review the current contract structure and implement fair pricing policies. There was a long pause. Then, I'll take this to the committee. Give me 2 weeks. 1 week, Michael said. People are going without water in 100-degree heat. We don't have time for committees to move slowly. At the mansion, Janet was called to a meeting with HR and Michael's attorney. She entered the room confident, accustomed to being the authority in these situations. She left understanding that her position had been fundamentally altered. Her spending authorization was suspended pending investigation. Her conduct had been documented. If she contested the findings, the evidence would be presented to law enforcement. She did not contest. Part 8. Ortiz felt the shift before he understood it. The first sign was inspectors visiting the kiosk more frequently, asking detailed questions about pricing structures, demanding documentation he had never needed to provide before. The second sign was the complaint filing that appeared on the city's public portal, detailed and specific, referencing contract clauses and regulatory requirements in language that suggested legal expertise. Someone was paying attention. Someone with resources. He reached out through his network, contacted the vendor who supplied both his kiosks and some private clients, asked if there had been any changes, any unusual scrutiny. The vendor mentioned that one client, a mansion in Hancock Park, had suddenly requested full audit trails for the past 2 years of purchases. Ortiz made the connection. The man who had bought water for the child at the park. The man who had observed too carefully. Who had stayed in his memory as someone who did not belong to the usual morning routine. He decided to respond the way he always had, by applying pressure at the weakest point. Through the mutual vendor, he reached out to Janet, whom he had never met, but whose role he understood. House managers controlled access, controlled information flow. They were gatekeepers, and gatekeepers could be useful. He fed her a story. Claire had been paid by Michael Carter to stage the park scene, to create a pretext for attacking the concession contract. The story had no basis, but it did not need to be true. It only needed to be plausible enough to generate doubt, to make Janet see Claire as a threat rather than a victim. Janet received the message and recognized it for what it was, an opportunity to neutralize someone who had become inconvenient. She called Claire into her office the next morning, closed the door, and spoke with cold precision. I've heard something disturbing. Apparently, there's talk that you've been working with Mr. Carter on some kind of scheme. That you deliberately put yourself in a situation at the park so he could play hero. That you're trying to leverage your position here for personal gain. Claire felt the floor tilt beneath her. That's not true. I'm telling you what I've heard, and whether it's true or not, The perception is damaging. To you, to this household, to the agency that placed you here, I'm going to have to recommend they reassign you. It was the nuclear option. Reassignment meant different houses, different schedules, probably worse pay. It meant instability for Luna, disruption of the routine Claire had fought to establish. But Claire had already prepared for this possibility. She had filed her report with the agency. She had documented Janet's threats. And she had learned something fundamental about power. It depended on silence, on isolation, on the assumption that no one would speak. "I've already filed a report with HR," Claire said quietly, "about your conduct, about the pressure you've applied, about the threats. It's all documented." Janet's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. "That was a mistake." "Maybe," Claire said, "but it's done. And now we both have our stories on record. The agency will investigate both, so we wait." She left Janet's office with her heart pounding, terrified, but clear in her purpose. She had done what she could. Now the system would have to respond. Part 9. The investigations moved simultaneously through different channels, each following its own logic, but converging toward the same conclusion. The systems that had allowed exploitation were failing under scrutiny. The city committee reviewed Michael's proposal in closed session, examined the evidence of price inflation, studied the contract renewal history. The concession arrangement had been built on assumptions that no longer held. That public parks could be monetized without limit, that private contracts could operate without transparency, that drought emergencies could be exploited rather than addressed. Michael's offer of funded infrastructure exposed these assumptions, made visible what had been deliberately kept obscure. After 8 days, the committee voted to suspend the exclusive beverage contract pending a comprehensive review. Ortiz was notified that his renewal would not be automatic, that new vendors could apply for permits, that price caps would be instituted immediately for essential items like water. The change was not radical, but it was structural. The monopoly was broken. Ortiz tried to appeal, hired an attorney to argue breach of contract, claimed that the city was acting under improper pressure. But the evidence of his pricing practices was too clear. The absence of required public amenities too obvious. His contract had included provisions for drinking fountains that had never been installed. He had charged prices that bore no relationship to costs. He had operated as if public space was private property. The appeal was denied. At the mansion, the internal audit reached its conclusion. Janet had systematically inflated procurement costs, directed purchases to vendors who provided her with undisclosed compensation, created off-book reserves that she controlled personally, and used her position to intimidate staff who might question her authority. The financial damage was quantifiable: $47,000 over 4 years. The human damage was not quantifiable, but equally clear. HR presented the findings to Janet in a final meeting. She was offered a choice: resign immediately with a neutral reference, or be terminated for cause with full legal exposure. She chose resignation. Her departure was announced to the household staff as a mutual decision, both parties moving in new directions. But everyone understood what it meant. The structure that had protected her was gone. The silence she had enforced was broken. Claire received a call from the agency HR director. The investigation had substantiated her report. Janet's conduct had violated multiple policies. The agency apologized formally and offered Claire a new placement in the same household, not as general housekeeping, but as residential supervisor, responsible for coordinating domestic staff and managing household operations. It was not just a promotion. It was a recognition that the person who had been willing to speak deserved to be heard. that authority should come with accountability, that the best person to manage a house fairly was someone who had experienced unfairness directly. Claire accepted, terrified and determined. She would need to learn new skills, assume new responsibilities, but she would do it knowing that she had earned the position, not through submission, but through the courage to tell the truth. Now, Part 10. The changes in the household unfolded gradually, each new policy and procedure representing a small shift in how power operated. Michael met with Claire 3 times during her first week as residential supervisor, asking for her input on procurement processes, staff scheduling, communication protocols. He did not assume he knew what workers needed. He asked. Claire proposed 3 immediate changes. First, all household purchases over $100 would require 3 competitive quotes, with the selection process documented. Second, domestic staff would have direct access to company HR through an anonymous digital portal, allowing them to report concerns without going through management. Third, benefits would be formalized in writing, paid sick leave, performance bonuses tied to objective standards, an education stipend for employees' children. Michael approved all 3 proposals and asked his attorney to draft the policy language. He also established a monthly household meeting where staff could raise concerns, suggest improvements, and review the previous month's operations. It was not revolutionary, but it was real. People had voice. Decisions were visible. Authority came with accountability. Luna benefited immediately. The education stipend covered her school supplies for the year and paid for her enrollment in a Saturday reading workshop at the local library. It was a small amount in the scale of the household budget, but for Claire and Luna, it meant something larger. The recognition that a child's needs mattered, that a mother's work had value beyond the hours logged. Claire settled into her new role cautiously, aware that change could be reversed, that structures required constant maintenance. She hired carefully, choosing people she had worked alongside, people who understood what it meant to labor without dignity and could therefore help build something different. She cross-trained staff so no single person held irreplaceable knowledge, so power could not concentrate invisibly. The mansion began to feel different. Not warmer. It was still a place of wealth and formality, but it felt less like a realm of arbitrary authority and more like a workspace with clear rules, known expectations, processes that could be understood and challenged. Michael watched the transformation with something like relief. He had built his fortune through systems, through understanding how structures functioned and where inefficiencies hid. But he had never applied that thinking to his own household, had assumed that domestic management was too small, too personal, too far removed from business logic to require such attention. He understood now that exploitation was scale invariant. The same dynamics that operated in corporate monopolies operated in household procurement. The same silencing mechanisms that protected corrupt contracts protected abusive managers. The same remedy applied: transparency, accountability, the willingness to see what had been deliberately hidden. Part 11. The park transformation took longer, but followed a similar arc. The drinking fountains were installed over a 6-week period, 8 stations distributed throughout the park grounds, each with multiple spigots at different heights, each with clear signage indicating free public access. Michael's foundation hired a local plumbing company to do the work, creating jobs while building infrastructure, connecting economic benefit to public good. The installation became an event in itself. Children watched the workers dig trenches, lay pipe, test pressure. When the first fountain was turned on, a small crowd gathered to watch water arc through the air, cold and clean and accessible. People filled bottles, splashed their faces, let their dogs drink. It was simple and necessary, and had been absent so long that its presence felt almost revolutionary. With the exclusive contract suspended, other vendors applied for permits to sell beverages in the park. The city instituted a lottery system, awarding 10 permits to different operators, with the requirement that at least one item on every menu had to be priced at cost. Competition lowered prices immediately. Water dropped to $2. Ice cream vendors appeared. A woman started selling fresh fruit cups from a cart, each one garnished with lime and chili powder, priced to be affordable. The park became more alive. The kiosks near the fountains served fewer customers, but maintained better quality, competing now on service and variety rather than monopoly. The runners still ran. The elderly still stretched. The children still chased pigeons. But now, thirst was not a tax on presence. Water was not rationed by income. Ortiz moved on, finding work at a private event center where his skills at maximizing concession revenue were valued without public scrutiny. He did not apologize or acknowledge wrongdoing. He simply left, understanding that the structure that had protected his practices no longer existed. Michael continued his Sunday morning runs, but now he stopped at the fountain sometimes, refilling his bottle alongside strangers, part of the routine rather than separate from it. He saw Claire occasionally, arriving with Luna for the girls' weekend reading workshop at the park's community room. They nodded to each other, acknowledgement without fuss. Two people who had been part of changing something. The city committee, pleased with the results and the positive press, began exploring similar partnerships for other parks in lower-income neighborhoods. Michael's foundation became a model. Private resources applied to public infrastructure, wealth used to build rather than extract, power exercised through creation rather than control. It was not a complete solution. Drought continued. Inequality persisted. One park improved while others languished. But the change was real, specific, documented. It proved that systems could shift when people refused to accept their given shape, when evidence replaced assumption, when those with resources chose to build rather than merely accumulate. Part 12. They chose a Saturday morning for the fountain dedication, a day when the park was full and the ceremony could be what Michael wanted. Not a performance for cameras, but a simple acknowledgement among those who used the space. No stage, no ribbon cutting, no politicians making speeches about their commitment to public service. Just people gathering near the new central fountain, the one positioned where the old kiosk had stood, the largest of the 8 installations. Michael invited the household staff, city officials who had moved the project forward, the workers who had installed the plumbing, neighborhood regulars who had documented the problems and pushed for solutions. He asked Claire to come with Luna, not as a symbol, but as someone whose truth had helped start the process, whose willingness to be seen had made everything else possible. Claire came reluctantly, uncomfortable with attention, with being positioned as the face of something larger than her private struggle. But Luna was excited, wanted to see the fountains she had heard about, wanted to understand what her mother had been part of creating. The crowd gathered loosely, people standing in the shade of the fountain's covered area, children already testing the water pressure, adults reading the simple plaque that explained the project. Public access to water is a basic right, not a market opportunity. These fountains were funded by the Carter Foundation and will be maintained through community partnership. May they serve all who need them. Michael spoke briefly, his words unscripted and direct. This project started the day I heard a mother tell her daughter she couldn't buy water. I had been running past that moment for months, seeing without seeing, assuming that prices were just prices, that scarcity was natural rather than designed. But scarcity in a public park is not natural. It's a choice, and we can make different choices. He paused, looking around at faces he recognized from morning runs, from the household, from the city offices that had approved the project. The fountains are here because a lot of people decided to pay attention, to document what was wrong, to propose something better. That's how change works, not with one gesture, but with many people choosing to see clearly and act accordingly. Next to the fountain, Michael had installed something else. A small vending station stocked with reusable bottles available for purchase at cost. The label on each bottle featured the logo of a new social enterprise, Shared Water, a project that used sales revenue to fund fountain maintenance in parks across the city. Every bottle sold contributed to the infrastructure that made bottles less necessary. Luna walked up to the dispenser, examined the bottles with the careful attention children bring to new things. Claire followed, and when Luna turned around holding one of the bottles, Claire saw the design clearly for the first time. It was the same design as the bottle Michael had handed Luna that first morning. The same blue label with its simple wave logo. The connection clicked. The water that had quenched her daughter's thirst months ago had come from this project, from the same foundation that had built these fountains, from the same commitment that connected one gesture to a structure. Michael had not bought Luna a bottle on impulse. He had bought it from a program he was already building, had connected private charity to public infrastructure, had understood that dignity required both immediate help and systemic change. Claire looked at Michael across the small crowd. He met her eyes and nodded, acknowledging what she had understood, what connected that first morning to this one. Luna turned on the fountain, let the water run over her hands, then cupped them and drank. It was simple and sufficient and free. Around them, other children did the same. Parents refilled bottles. Runners stopped mid-route to cool down. The park functioned as it should have always functioned, as public space that served public need without extracting private cost. The ceremony ended without formal conclusion. People drifted back to their routines, running, walking, reading on benches, playing in the grass. The fountains became part of the landscape, unremarkable in their presence, noticed only when their absence was imagined. Claire returned to work Monday with Luna's bottle in her bag, a small reminder that the world could change, that silence could break, that dignity did not have to be purchased at inflated prices. She supervised staff with the memory of supervision she had endured, aware that power was a tool that could build or destroy, protect or exploit. Michael continued his runs, his meetings, his work building things that lasted, but he ran differently now, seeing the city as something he was part of, rather than separate from, understanding that wealth meant responsibility, that power required accountability, that change was not an event, but a continuous choice to see clearly and act accordingly. For Luna, it was simpler. She knew that when she was thirsty at the park, she could drink. She knew her mother supervised the house where they had once felt small. She knew the world could be cruel, and also that cruelty was not inevitable. She would carry these lessons forward, understand that fairness required effort, that silence protected nothing, that speaking cost something, but silence cost more. The park along the LA River continued its ordinary life, full of people walking through heat and drought, through inequality and struggle, through the small daily acts of survival and joy. The fountains ran clear and cold, free for anyone who needed them. Proof that public space could serve public good, that systems could change when people refused to accept their given shape, that one person's thirst connected to everyone's access, that dignity was not a commodity, but a right available to all who chose to claim it.